Lenora Whitlow and Harlan Vexley were both 60 when they found love again, marrying against all odds in the quiet town of Ravenbrook. But neither of them knew that their greatest threat wouldn't come from the outside world, but from the children they raised. At 60 years old, Lenora Bryce had resigned herself to a quiet, solitary life. After losing her husband to cancer 12 years earlier, she had dedicated her days to her modest home, her garden, and her book club. She lived in the outskirts of Ravenbrook, a town where time moved slowly and people rarely left. Despite her silence and routine, her mind often drifted to the idea of companionship. Not out of desperation, but because the house echoed too loudly, especially in the evenings. Harlan Vexley, also 60, had lived a very different life. He had served in the military in his youth, then worked as a machinist before retiring early due to heart issues. Widowed for 9 years, he carried a gruff, quiet dignity and a habit of rising before dawn. He had 2 knee surgeries, a daughter, who rarely visited, and an old pickup truck that still smelled like his late wife's perfume. Harlan had stopped expecting anything new from life until he met Lenora at the Ravenbrook Gardening Club. Their first encounter wasn't magical, just 2 strangers reaching for the same packet of zinnia seeds. But that moment led to a short conversation, and then another the following week. They began sharing stories about compost, fertilizer, and funny neighbor tales. Over months, their casual meetings became the highlight of their weeks. One day, Lenora invited Harlan over for tea, and after that, it became a tradition. By the time spring came, their friendship had blossomed into something deeper. Neighbors began to notice Harlan's truck parked outside Lenora's home more often. The 2 went on walks through the Ravenbrook Arboretum, shared meals at small diners, and even took a weekend trip to the coast. Their bond felt natural and comforting. They laughed often and rarely disagreed. When Harlan proposed in the middle of Lenora's backyard, she didn't hesitate. He had brought no ring, just a little silver key, offering her access to his heart and his home. She accepted, and they planned a small ceremony under the magnolia tree Lenora had planted years earlier. The guest list was tiny: close friends, neighbors, and a few club members. But there were 2 glaring absences. Lenora's only son, Kenton Bryce, refused to attend. He claimed the marriage was a mistake. Kenton believed Lenora was rushing into a commitment without considering the legal and financial consequences. He'd grown distant after her husband died, only calling on holidays and checking in when he needed something. Seeing his mother happy with another man, especially one who now shared ownership of her home, unsettled him. Harlan's daughter, Mira Vexley, had an even colder response. She said she couldn't trust Lenora and suggested Harlan was being manipulated. Mira, an accountant in a nearby city, prided herself on her logical thinking. To her, the relationship screamed red flags. She brought up inheritance, medical decisions, and control of family assets. When Harlan told her he planned to revise his will, she accused him of betraying her mother's memory. Despite their children's rejection, Lenora and Harlan stood under the magnolia tree on a cool September afternoon and exchanged vows. There was no band, no tuxedos, no white dress. Just 2 people smiling through tears as they promised to be each other's companion in the final chapters of life. Friends cheered. A neighbor took photos. It was a beautiful moment, simple but full of meaning. After the wedding, the couple moved into Lenora's house. Harlan sold his property and handed the proceeds to a local veterans group. He said he didn't want baggage. For a while, it seemed like they had carved out a corner of peace for themselves. They took turns cooking, planting new vegetables in the backyard, and watching old detective shows in the evenings. The house no longer echoed with emptiness. But beneath that peace, unspoken tension began to build. Neither Lenora nor Harlan could ignore the coldness from their children. Birthday cards went unreturned. Phone calls were ignored. Old family photos were taken down. Still, they tried to push forward. They didn't know it yet, but their attempt at late-in-life happiness had awakened something dark in their children. Something that would twist love into resentment, and eventually, murder. Mira Vexley wasn't the kind of person who let go of control easily. She had spent her entire adult life managing accounts, reading fine print, and ensuring that every cent in her father's pension was accounted for. So when she learned that Harlan had legally added Lenora's name to his bank accounts and listed her as the sole beneficiary on his will, something inside her snapped. It wasn't about money. At least, that's what she told herself. To her, it was about manipulation, vulnerability, and her father making an emotional decision he couldn't reverse. She began collecting information. Mira contacted her father's former attorney and requested access to documents under the pretense of protecting his interests. When she was denied, she turned to less ethical methods. She went through old mail he had forwarded to her during his hospital stays, gathered medical records, and pieced together the timeline of his relationship with Lenora. She noted every appointment, transaction, and change in routine. Meanwhile, Kenton Bryce was doing something similar, but from a very different angle. His concern wasn't financial strategy, it was legacy. The Bryce family house, with its creaky floorboards and sunlit attic, had been passed down through 3 generations. To him, the idea that a man who had known his mother for barely a year could now claim co-ownership was an insult. He began showing up unannounced, demanding conversations with Lenora. At first, he tried subtle pressure. He brought up the house deed, inheritance taxes, and potential legal disputes. Lenora brushed him off, assuring him everything was fine. But Kenton wasn't reassured. He grew more confrontational. Once, he followed Harlan to the grocery store and cornered him in the parking lot. Harlan kept his calm, but the message was clear. Kenton didn't approve, and he wasn't going away. After that, Lenora and Harlan began keeping their front gate locked and limited their outings. They even skipped the gardening club, the very place they had first met. It became easier to avoid town than to deal with the stares and whispers. Mira, in the meantime, took her anger public. She began posting cryptic messages on social media, accusing unnamed individuals of taking advantage of seniors. She joined an elder advocacy group and told others that her father was being isolated. She hinted that Lenora had moved quickly and that Harlan no longer had autonomy. Though she never named names, locals caught on quickly. The posts were shared, commented on, and turned into whispers across coffee shops and post office lines. Then came the first act of real malice. One morning, Harlan discovered that all 4 tires of his truck had been slashed. A hateful message was scratched into the driver's door, one that referenced stealing old men's lives. They reported it to the police, but without security footage or witnesses, the case went nowhere. Harlan quietly installed cameras around the house. He didn't tell Mira or Kenton, not wanting to stir more conflict. 2 weeks later, one of those cameras captured something chilling. At 1:12 a.m., a figure appeared near the gate. The person didn't enter, didn't vandalize, just stood there, motionless, staring at the house for nearly 8 minutes. The grainy footage revealed it was Mira. She wore a dark coat, hood pulled, up, arms folded, barely moving. Then she walked away. Lenora urged Harlan to report it, but he refused. He believed Mira was just angry, not dangerous. He still saw her as his daughter, the one who used to sit on his lap as a child and beg him to fix her broken toys. He wanted to believe that the pain was temporary, that one day their children would come around. That maybe, with time, Mira and Kenton would see that this marriage wasn't a threat. But the distance only grew. Kenton stopped speaking to his mother entirely. Mira sent Harlan a certified letter demanding access to his medical files. Neither of them visited for the holidays. Lenora decorated the tree by herself, while Harlan quietly turned off his phone. They still held hands in the quiet of the evening, pretending that love was enough to shield them. But something had shifted. What started as bitterness was turning into obsession. And in Ravenbrook, the people closest to them were beginning to choose sides, some with sympathy, others with suspicion. A quiet war had started, and no one knew how dangerous it would become. Winter arrived in Ravenbrook with a sharpness that seemed to freeze more than just the air. Lenora and Harlan felt it in the silence that surrounded them. Their world had shrunk to the walls of their home, where once lively phone calls were replaced with echoing quiet. They pretended not to notice the long pauses between conversations, the tense glances when the mail arrived, or the subtle hesitation before unlocking the front door. Something was changing, and they both felt it. Even if they didn't want to admit it, the couple kept busy in small ways. Lenora baked, Harlan read through war memoirs and tinkered with an old clock in the garage. They went for occasional drives to avoid the whispers around town. Yet, even on the open road, they felt watched. One afternoon, while parked by a frozen lake, a black sedan appeared behind them, stayed for several minutes, then disappeared. Harlan tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but Lenora didn't believe in those anymore. One morning, Lenora went out to collect the newspaper and found a letter inside the mailbox, unmarked, unsealed. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed, in bold type, "He won't wake up next time." There was no name, no return address, and no fingerprints when police dusted for them. The officer on duty shrugged it off as a prank, but Harlan and Lenora knew better. This was a message, clear, threatening, and personal. Lenora's nerves began to fray. She stopped attending book club. She pulled curtains closed at all hours. At night, she sat by the window, watching the gate, a flashlight in her lap. Harlan tried to distract her with television or music, but she wasn't the same. She'd lost her peace, and now she was starting to lose her sense of safety too. Then came the break-in. It happened just after midnight on a Thursday. A side window was pried open while Harlan and Lenora slept. The alarm they'd recently installed blared, startling them awake. By the time Harlan grabbed his flashlight and hurried down the stairs, the intruder had already gone. Nothing was taken. Not the electronics, not the jewelry box, not even Harlan's prized war medals on the shelf. But on the living room wall, scrawled in red spray paint, was a chilling message. "Old love dies next." The police responded quickly this time, likely because of the growing tension surrounding the couple. News of the incident spread through Ravenbrook. Some neighbors offered support, dropping off casseroles and flowers. Others kept their distance. The whispers intensified. People speculated about Kenton and Mira, about wills, about family bitterness. Rumors turned into theories, and soon even strangers in grocery stores gave Lenora strange looks. That weekend, Harlan asked Lenora if they should move, maybe to a quieter town where no one knew them, but Lenora refused. This was her home, her garden, her life. She wouldn't be chased out by fear, not even by her own blood. But fear was already inside the house. Mira, in her city apartment, was losing sleep. She obsessed over her father's well-being, checking the news and scanning social media for updates. She joined private forums for adult children of aging parents and posted long, anonymous rants. Her tone grew darker. She wrote about being shut out and disrespected. Her posts were filled with accusations of brainwashing, of elder exploitation, of betrayal. One night she posted, "Sometimes people need to be scared straight before they destroy their own family." Kenton, meanwhile, took a more practical route. He contacted a probate lawyer and tried to challenge the legality of Lenora and Harlan's will revisions. When the attorney explained that he had no standing, Kenton exploded. He sent his mother a series of letters filled with legal threats and moral condemnation. Each one grew more aggressive than the last. Lenora burned them without responding. In a house filled with fear, Harlan and Lenora did their best to keep routine. They still had tea each morning. Harlan still fixed the loose porch steps. Lenora still trimmed the hedges, though her hands shook more than before. They tried to hold on to normalcy, but even the smallest crack can spread. They didn't realize it yet, but everything was building toward a single moment, something that would fracture the calm forever. Each unspoken word, each ignored threat, Each quiet compromise was pushing them closer to a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And on the other side of that line was something neither of them had ever imagined: murder. The night of the murder began without warning, cloaked in routine and quiet resolve. The wind howled through the trees lining Ravenbrook's oldest street, where Lenora and Harlan had now lived together for just over a year. It was a cold evening, and the frost had already begun to creep along the edges of the window panes. Harlan was in his study, softly humming as he oiled the gears of the antique clock he'd nearly completed. Lenora, meanwhile, was in the kitchen, folding linen napkins she had no plans to use. They weren't expecting company. No one visited anymore. At 9:14 p.m., the motion sensor light above the side garage clicked on. Lenora looked out through the curtains and saw nothing but branches swaying. They were both on edge after the break-in, so every small noise now carried weight. Harlan grabbed a flashlight, but after scanning the area and finding nothing, he dismissed it as a stray raccoon. Lenora tried to believe him. At 11:06 p.m., the power cut out. It was sudden. No flicker, no warning, just silence. The house plunged into darkness, and within seconds, Harlan's backup lantern was in his hands. He lit it and moved toward the basement, thinking a fuse had blown. Lenora remained upstairs, trying to reach the electric company on her phone, but there was no signal. She went to the window to wave her phone toward the sky for service. That's when she saw the black sedan again. It was parked just beyond the streetlight, engine idling, windows fogged. Her stomach twisted. Then came the sound, a sharp thump, like something heavy being dropped upstairs. Lenora froze. Lenora. Harlan was in the basement. She turned toward the stairwell and called his name, her voice barely louder than a whisper. No reply came. Her instincts told her to hide, but curiosity edged her forward. Slowly, she climbed the stairs, holding on to the railing, her breath short and shallow. The hallway was pitch black. The lantern's light didn't reach this far. Another sound followed. A softer rustle, a creaking floorboard. It was coming from the guest room, the one they hadn't used in months. She edged closer and reached for the doorknob. But before her hand made contact, the door burst open. She was knocked backward. A hooded figure charged out, shoving her against the wall. She collapsed with a gasp, dazed but conscious. The intruder sprinted down the stairs, but by then, Harlan was already coming up from the basement with a wrench in hand. The two collided in the dark. There was a scuffle, grunts, the sound of metal hitting bone, something crashing to the floor. Lenora scrambled to her feet and reached the bottom of the stairs, just in time to see the figure dart out the back door, vanishing into the black night. Harlan was bleeding from the head. Lenora tried to call for help, but her phone was still without service. She wrapped a towel around his wound and guided him to the couch. He muttered that he'd be fine, but Lenora wasn't sure. His pulse was erratic. He winced when she touched his shoulder. She stayed with him, whispering to keep him conscious, counting the seconds in her head. When the power returned 47 minutes later, Harlan had stopped breathing. The ambulance came too late. Paramedics tried to revive him, but his injuries were worse than they had appeared. A fractured skull, internal bleeding. He was pronounced dead at 12:22 a.m. Lenora sat beside him, numb, silent, her hands shaking against the edges of her lap. She gave her statement to the police in a flat voice, recounting the night in exacting detail, but one truth she held back. She had recognized the figure's build, the height, the gait, even the way he used his left shoulder to push the door. It wasn't a stranger. It was Kenton. She didn't tell the police. Not yet. Maybe she needed proof. Maybe she needed to be sure. Or maybe deep down, she still wanted to believe it was someone else, anyone else. But she knew what she had seen. And she also knew that something darker had just begun. Lenora had lost the love of her life. And now, she was about to uncover how far hate could really go. The days after Harlan's death were suffocating. Lenora moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps soft and uncertain. Police came and went, combing through the scene. asking her to recall every detail again and again. She answered their questions, but her mind was stuck in a loop, replaying that final hour, the blood on the towel, the panic in Harlan's eyes. No one had been arrested. The case was open but cold, already drifting into limbo. The official report cited an unidentified male suspect, and though the security camera above the garage had caught grainy footage of someone fleeing into the night, the face was obscured by a hood. There were no fingerprints, no tire marks. It seemed the killer had vanished. But Lenora hadn't forgotten what she saw. She couldn't erase the image of the figure's posture, the unmistakable limp in his left leg, an old injury Kenton had from a motorcycle crash years ago. At the funeral, Kenton stood at the edge of the service, silent, arms crossed. He never approached Lenora. Mira, in contrast, wept openly and held her stepmother's hand tightly, though Lenora noticed how dry her eyes remained. Everyone wore black, but not everyone wore grief. Lenora watched them both from beneath her veil, a mix of sorrow and suspicion, burning behind her eyes. After the burial, she didn't return home. Instead, she checked into a quiet inn on the edge of town, claiming she needed time to process. But that wasn't why she left the house. Lenora had begun her own investigation. With a folder of documents, a burner phone, and access to old emails Harlan had forwarded to her, she pieced together everything. She discovered that Kenton had recently been denied a personal loan for his failing business. She learned that Mira had maxed out multiple credit cards and had a growing online gambling problem. Both of them had motive. Both had something to lose if Harlan and Lenora rewrote the will. What caught her attention most, though, was a deleted message she recovered from an old cloud backup, an email sent by Mira to Kenton 2 months before the wedding. It read simply, "If we don't act soon, we'll lose everything." Lenora made copies of every file, every screenshot, and compiled them into a binder. She mailed one to her attorney and kept another in a safety deposit box. But it wasn't enough. She needed closure. She needed truth spoken aloud. So she set a trap. She invited Kenton and Mira to her home under the guise of reading Harlan's final letter, something she claimed had surfaced after the funeral. Curious and perhaps greedy, they both agreed to come. She served them tea, spoke, softly, played the grieving widow with perfect grace. Then she handed each of them a copy of the binder. For a long moment, no one spoke. Mira's fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages. Kenton's jaw tightened. Lenora watched their reactions like a hawk. Then she dropped the final piece, a voice recording from a wiretap placed outside Mira's apartment days after the murder. It was scratchy, but clear enough. Mira's voice. "He wasn't supposed to die, Kenton. Just scare him." "What did you do?" Kenton. "Don't act like you weren't in on it. We planned this together." There was a silence, followed by something else. Footsteps, a door slamming shut. Lenora stared at them without blinking. Neither of her stepchildren said a word. Kenton reached for his phone, but it was too late. Lenora had already sent the audio to the police. Sirens began to echo in the distance. By the time authorities arrived, neither Mira nor Kenton tried to run. Their guilt had crushed them long before the handcuffs did. At the trial, the jury heard everything. About the jealousy, the inheritance, the plan to stage a break-in. Mira received 20 years. Kenton got life without parole. Lenora returned home alone, but not broken. She planted wildflowers in Harlan's memory and restored the antique clock he'd worked so hard on. Time moved forward, but she never forgot. What was taken from her? What started as love between two seniors had ended in betrayal, greed, and murder, all at the hands of those who should have simply been happy for them.